So the Gemara was this new Gemara about a dry lulav. So previously we were talking about a stolen lulav for about maybe 4 days or so. Now we're going to talk about a dry lulav, a dried out lulav. It's dried out. It's no longer has its moisture, its green color, and so on. And so it's gotten dried out. And there's an argument. Our Mishnah said if it's dried out, it's invalid. But the Brisa or Tosefta brings an argument, really. And of course, it brings the rabbi's opinion that it's invalid, like we saw in the Mishnah. But also it has the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is that it's kosher, a dried out lulav. Rava tries to explain in what case is this argument applicable? Meaning, where does Rabbi Yehuda permit this? Does he permit it with all of the 4 species? Or does he only permit it a lulav that's dried out? But an esrog maybe that's dried out, maybe we'll have a different law. So it's a little vague from this Tosefta where Rabbi Yehuda permits. Is it specifically in this case or not? So Rava comes to try to explain to us and tell us, clarify, I should say, that this argument only applies about the lulav, but it doesn't apply to the other species, doesn't apply to an esrog. And he has a reason behind it. What's his reason? His reason is that it doesn't say hadar, beautiful, when it comes to lulav. It says by esrog, but it doesn't say by lulav. So that's the logic why it should make a difference. Again, these you would think, it's a mitzvah. It can't be. You have to use something nice for the mitzvah. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, no. It says hadar with regard to the esrog. It doesn't say hadar with regard to the lulav. So Rabbi Yehuda says a lulav doesn't need to be hadar. It doesn't have to be beautiful. It could be dried out is kosher. It's good. It's okay. Now, this is Rava's explanation. The Gemara goes through a number of questions on Rava's assumption. So he's making this, he's trying to clarify this differentiation between the lulav and the esrog. Now, before you get to the questions that the Gemara asks on him, tries to prove it wrong, but the first thing you have to understand is, so does it say hadar by lulav or does it not say hadar by lulav? If it doesn't say hadar by lulav, well, why do the rabbis say it's invalid if it's dried out? If it does say hadar by lulav, then the question would be right where Yehuda would permit a dried out lulav. It says hadar. So the thing is that if you look at the pasuk talks about the esrog. It says hadar, and that word hadar really is not talking about the lulav. However, there's something called a hekesh. And a hekesh means that the Torah pushed them to bang them together, and it compares the two, and it says that you should compare these laws. So the rabbis have a tradition about this hekesh that that it's supposed to be compared. You're supposed to compare the law. So if it says this law by esrog, it'll also apply to lulav. That's the way the rabbis understand it. Now, Rabbi Yehuda will hold that I don't have such a tradition that you're supposed to compare these two laws, and therefore it says it by esrog. It's limited to esrog. It said it by lulav. I would say it by lulav, but it says by esrog. Compare the laws. I don't have such a tradition. This is the way we understood, according to Rashi. that you need to have a tradition in order to be able to compare to make such a method of understanding Jewish law. You need to have a tradition about it. Otherwise, you can't just come up with it on your own because the pasuk in the verse it says it next to it. That's not good enough. That's the way Rashi learns. If you look in Rashi, you can't make such a teaching on your own from all the 13 codes that the Torah is deciphered with. Only one of them works that way. It's called the Kavachem. So Rashi learns that way, that the difference between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis is based on if you have such a tradition or not such. You don't have that tradition. The rabbis had a tradition that was supposed to compare the law of lulav to the law of Esrog. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't have a tradition. We're not going to compare it. So therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it turns out that a lulav that's dried out is kosher. The rabbis compare it to Esrog. They say a lulav that's dried out is not kosher. It has to be hadar. It has to be beautiful. So that's the way Rashi learned. Now Teves, we said, argued. Teves holds that you can make such a teaching on your own, and there is one method of deciphering the code of the Torah that you cannot do on your own. That's called the Gezerah Shavah. That's one of the 13, but not all of them. Rashi learns all of them you can't do on your own. Only a Kavachemer is as an exception, but basically you can't decipher the Torah on your own unless you have a tradition from your teachers, and they have a tradition from their teachers all the way back to Moses. Teves disagrees. He says no, you could actually make such a. You could make such a teaching on your own. He says, so then why doesn't Rabbi Yehuda connect lulav to Esrog? Why doesn't he do it? You see, the pasuk compares it to it, puts it right next to it. In fact, someone mentioned yesterday, I think Ezra mentioned, that you're just moving the comma from one place to the other. So it's really, you could put that word with the sentence before it or sentence after it. You move the comma away. So, but the thing, Teves says that Rabbi Yehuda must be arguing that he doesn't think that the word hadar belongs to a branch. It fits for a fruit, but not for a branch. That's the way Teves understands it, that there must be some other issue that Rabbi Yehuda has, not because of the hekesh makes sense to darshan, to expound upon. But he says it must be that maybe there's something else. Maybe it has to do with the fact that hadar, the word beautiful, fits for, you don't say beautiful on everything. Certain things you use, certain terms are befitting for that item. Something the beautiful is not a term you would use like for a man. You would say handsome. You don't say you look beautiful. You say handsome. So certain things you don't use the term that term hadar in the Hebrew. It doesn't fit for certain things. Now, the Gemara asks a number of questions on Rava's qualification of this argument, the way Rava qualifies the argument. Gemara questions it and says, what you're saying is not necessarily correct. Well, the first question the Gemara had was, by lulav, are you sure Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold it needs to be beautiful? We had in our Mishnah where Rabbi Yehuda talks about tying the lulav when the branches start spreading out. You got to tie them together above. It would make sense to say, but it's because he holds it needs to be beautiful. So my answer is no, that's not the reason. The reason is because it says kafus, kapois, kafus. It could be read kafus. It means to be tied together. It's supposed to be tied down. So you're supposed to tie down the lulav, and the way Rabbi Yehuda understands it is if it's spreading out, you got to tie it down. Then the Gemara says, are you sure he doesn't hold it has to be beautiful? Don't we know that it says that you get the lulav, when you tie the lulav, you need to use minoi, has to be its min, its species. Seemingly, the reason it would have to be its own species that you tie it with, if you tie the lulav together with the hadassim and the aravis, with the myrtles and the willows, and you tie it together, seemingly the reason why it has to be specifically tied, the rabbis disagree with this. The rabbis say you could tie it with anything. Yehuda says, no, you got to tie it with its own type. So seemingly this means that it's got to match. It's got to look good. And so that would imply, like Rabbi Yehuda holds, that you need to have the lulav looking up to par. It has to look nice. It has to be hadar. So maybe that's maybe he holds it does have to be hadar. The Gemara answers that that's not true. And the reason how do we know it's not true? It's not true because he even allows you to use fiber from the palm tree or you could use the root of the palm tree. So you see, these things don't have a nice look. It has something to do with Bal Tosef. You can't add another species. Now, the question really on this is, what do the rabbis do with that? The rabbis disagree, and they say you're allowed to tie it with even something that's not the min of the lulav. It's not the type of the lulav, and yet you would be allowed to use it. Why do the rabbis allow you to use something else? Isn't it Bal Tosef? Isn't it adding on to the mitzvahs? You're only supposed to use 4 species. Imagine you go and take a branch from an oak tree. You take a leaf from an oak tree and tie it together. It's a different type of tree. It's not a date palm. You go and how about you bring some other item and you tie the lulav with some other item. Isn't that Bal Tosef? Isn't that adding on to the mitzvahs? So the answer is yes, Jeffrey. Okay, we can't hear you. Okay, so the answer is, oh, okay, yeah, Jeffrey.
Please, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I didn't realize you were going to say the answer is next. So,
no, tell us what's the answer.
I think it's ironic because we're supposed to make the mitzvos as beautiful as possible, and so with certain restrictions, clearly we can still beautify the mitzvah and also make it practical that we can hold the 3 different kinds of the elements together without dropping it.
Right. Okay, but that it sounds like you're you're a little ahead of us. We're reviewing yesterday's piece. From the wording you used, it sounds like you're seem to be discussing a Gemara that we're about to learn after.
Oh, okay.
But
okay.
But nevertheless, anyway, so the question that I had asked is, what do the rabbis do? And the rabbis say you're allowed to use other species to tie it together, which would end up being maybe Bal Tosef. You're adding on to the mitzvahs. You're supposed to have 4. Now you got 5. You're supposed to only have the date palm and the citron, myrtle, and the willow. And now you're also using an oak leaf to tie it together. So you got 4. You're using a 5th item. That's Bal Tosef. That's adding to the mitzvahs. Why is that not a problem? So on that, the commentaries mention that because it's not a mitzvah, because you're not obligated to tie it together, so that item is not counted. If you hold you need to tie the lulav and esrog together, so then that item is counted as part of the mitzvah. And if you use a fifth item, a fifth species, that will be 5 instead of 4. It'll be Baal Toisif. It'll be adding on to the mitzvahs. But if it's not a mitzvah to tie it, it's just a nice thing to do. It's just you're beautifying mitzvah and tying it, but that's not part of the mitzvah. Then we don't look at it as if it's a fifth species. We look at it as you have 4 species there and you happen to beautify it with something, but it's not considered a portion of the mitzvah that you added on to the mitzvah. So that is that's the understanding in the rabbis. Now, the Gemara continues and says that, so according to Rabbi Yehuda, the reason why you can't do this is not because of the reason why you can't use an outside item, not because it's supposed to be beautiful and match, but rather it has to do with not sinning by adding on a mitzvah. The Gemara now shifts to the point that Rava said that Esrog needs to be hadar, even according to Rabbi Yehuda. It's lulav where Rabbi Yehuda has his argument on the rabbis, but Esrog, everyone agrees it says hadar. Everyone agrees it's got to be beautiful. Even Rabbi Yehuda argues by lulav, but he agrees that Esrog needs to be beautiful. So the Gemara asks on that. So the Gemara shifts to that part of this of Rava's statement. That is that really true? That Esrog, Rabbi Yehuda holds it needs to be beautiful. We have a brisa or a Tosefta here as well. It seems like this is a Tosefta that for this 4 species of the lulav, you can't just like you can't subtract, you can't add on to them. And then it talks about the Yesra, a second law. It says if you have an Esra, you didn't find an Esra, you can't bring something as a substitute, quince or a pomegranate or any other item. You can't use another item as a substitute. And then the third law that it says is that kimushin, when it withers, these species are withered, then they are kosher. Yavation, if they're dried out, they're puzzle, they're invalid. And Rabbi Yehuda says even yavation, even dried out, is valid. Now, what exactly is this part of this Tosefta talking about? The first case of the Tosefta was talking about all 4 species. The second case was talking about the Esra. The third case, it just says plural, kamushin, if they are withered, withering or withered. So if they are withered, so then like they're partially drying out, then it says they're kosher. It doesn't say what. Is it the Esrog? Is it the 4 species? It doesn't say. But the Gemara assumes that this means all 4, including the lulav. They're dried out, they're kosher. But if they're withered, partially dried out, they're kosher. But if they're fully dried out, they're invalid. And then Rabbi Yehuda argues and says it's kosher. This probably is going on all 4. And now Rabbi Yehuda says that there's even this is even a story where the people of the big city, they used to inherit their lulav to their grandchildren, because they don't have date palms growing in their area, and so this was it. They would inherit it to their grandchildren. They would inherit their date palm. They would use these old date palms. They would use their old lulav from previous years. Now, what is the Gemara bringing this story? Well, the Gemara continues and says, and the rabbis argued with him and says, you can't bring a proof from such a story, Shas Adchak, That's a case of great need. But we want to talk about if it's not a time of great need. If you have a dried out lulav and you used it, do you have to go shake again? And the answer is, the rabbis say, then you do have to. If there's nothing else, and that's another story. That's called shas. That's called real shas adchat. That's called the, real time of great need. But here you shook already. Go get another lulav. Go shake. So the rabbis argued on Rabbi Yehuda about the dried out. And Rabbi Yehuda wanted to prove from this story that dried out is kosher, and the fact that they would inherit their lulavs to their grandchildren. And so the rabbis disagreed and said that's not a proof. That's a case called shas hadchak, a time of great need. But if it's not a time of great need, then even if you shook already, it's called b'diavad, when you already did it. Even then, it's not good. You got to go do it again. There's a lot of laws that we tell you, b'diavad, if you already did it, it's okay. It's kosher. You shouldn't have done it that way. You already did it. That's literally what the word b'diavad means. We often use it to mean a time of need. But the literal meaning of b'diavad is b'diavad, when you did it already. If you did it already, then we tell you, it's okay. You did it already. You don't have to go back and do it again. We're not going to bother you, burden you to go back and do it again. Now, here, the rabbis they divide the two terms, the shas hadchak and b'diavad. And here they say, shas hadchak, that you use a dried out lulav, that story, you're right, Rabbi Yehuda, that was shas hadchak. But if it's not shas hadchak, not a time of great need, then even if it's b'diavad, you got to go do it again. Even if you did it already with a dried out lulav, you live in a place where there are lulavs around, then even if you shook already, we could tell you, go back and shake again. Okay, so now we got these three laws. We have this Tosefta that told us about the concept of you can't have less, you can't have more, okay, you have to use these four species. It told us about an esrog, that if you didn't find the esrog, you can't substitute it with something else. And then it told us about the law of commotion and yevation, that if it's dried out and or semi-dried out, you have even Rabbi Yehuda's opinion that it's kosher even if it's fully dried out. And we have the story. Now, what is this? How does this prove anything about Rabbi Yehuda that we're trying to prove? We're trying to find some type of proof to Rava's statement about Rabbi Yehuda regarding his esrog, his law that esrog he holds needs to be hadar. Somehow we're going to try to say that you see from this Tosefta that it doesn't have to be hadar. Where do you see it? So the Tosefta doesn't clearly say what case it's talking about. It just says also yevation is kosher, even also if it's dried out, completely dried out, it's still kosher. That's Rabbi Yehuda's statement here. The Gemara says probably it's going on the esrog. And seemingly what he means is the Tosefta didn't spell out which of the four species it's talking about. And the previous sentence of the Tosefta talked about the esrog. And two sentences before talked about all the species. So seemingly it's either talking about an esrog. Now, the thing is that the story case of it talks about a lulav. So to say that he's not talking about a lulav would sound strange because he brings a proof from the case of lulav. So seemingly the way the Gemara is understanding it is that's probably going on all four. And on all four cases, if they're dried out, Rabbi Yehuda permits them. And on this, the Gemara says, no, that's not that. In other words, if that was the meaning, it would prove Rava wrong. So the Gemara is trying to say it seems from this Tosefta that Rava's wrong because he says dried out on all of them is kosher, according to Rabbi Yehuda. And Rava's claim was, no, Rabbi Yehuda, it says Hadar. It says Hadar. He's not going to hold that it's dried out. It's gonna be kosher. No, it says Hadar by Esrog. Lulav, you could say such a thing. By Esrog, you can't say such a thing. So that's the Gemara now. The Gemara says that we see a brisa. He says it's kosher, even by esrog. My love, isn't it talking about an esrog? Talking about an esrog, even it's dried out. The Gemara says no. The way you have to learn the Tosefta is that it's going on lulav. First part was talking about the 4 species. Then it talked about the esrog. Then it talks about lulav as it brings the story, which clearly talks about the lulav. So the Gemara understands it to mean that it's solely talking about the lulav and not about the esrog. So that's the understanding here at this point that Rabbi Yehuda, his statement about a dried out lulav only applies to lulav, and it has to do with because he doesn't learn this hekish. He doesn't hold that they're supposed to be learned from each other. That's the understanding. Okay. Now the Gemara says that the same way the Gemara now explains this Tosefta. What did the Tosefta say? So when the Gemara goes back on a previous statement, it says Amar Mar, Master said. You just said a Tosefta. We just brought this, and on this the Gemara wants to say something. So, what was the statement that is applicable here? The statement that the Tosefta said that's applicable is the same way you do not take less than the 4 species, you also can't add to the 4 species. That's what the Tosefta said. And the Gemara asks on that, Pshita, isn't that obvious? It's obvious. This is a famous verse in the Torah. You're not allowed to subtract, you're not allowed to add, like Soisif olav, like Sigra, you're not allowed to add, you're not allowed to subtract. It's pretty obvious. So what do we need the Tosefta to tell us this for? It's obvious not to add or subtract to the mitzvahs. So the Gemara answers that Mahu de Tema, you may have said that Rabbi Yehuda holds that a lulav needs to be tied, and if you brought a additional item, but you did not tie it with the other items, b'maisa minach rina, it says, if you brought another item, but you're not tying it together, each one is really an entity of its own. And if they're an entity of their own, then it comes out that you did not sin with Baal Tosef, adding on a mitzvah. Why? Because Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion you need to tie them together. If you didn't tie it together, then it's really not part of it. If it's not part of it, then you don't have Baal Tosef, you don't have that addition. So that would be the thought that, okay, the thought is, if I would tie it with my lulav, like the hadassim and the aravais, the myrtles and the willows, if I would tie them together, then that's a prohibition of Baal Tosef. You're not allowed to add to the mitzvahs. But if I'm not going to tie it together, and Rabbi Yehuda holds you need to tie together in order to do the mitzvah properly. So if I'm not going to tie it together, then I'm all set. I can carry it. I can carry it in my other hand. I can hold it. The Gemara uses the term, these are on their own, and those are on their own. Those are on their own, meaning each one maybe should be looked at separately. Kamash malon, the Tosefta comes and lets us hear that no, they're not on their, they're not separate. You're bringing them together, then it could be it will be a problem of Baal Tosef. You're adding on to the mitzvah. Okay, then the Gemara says that let's talk about the next case of the Tosefta. What is the next case of the Tosefta? The next case of the Tosefta was that if you didn't find an esrog, do not say, I'll find a substitute. I use a substitute. No, don't do that. So the Gemara asks, Pshita, of course, what do you think you're going to, the Torah tells you to take an esrog. It's not telling you to take some other item. So why would you think of finding a substitute? Yes, the halacha is right that you can't use a substitute. But the Gemara says, yeah, that's so obvious that it shouldn't even say it in a Tosefta. So the Gemara answers, no. I would have thought that you should bring another item. Why? Why would you bring another item? Because it's not that you're bringing another item claiming that it's the other item is holy, but rather what you're doing is you're reminding people that you're supposed to have 4 species. So if you have another item, it'll be like a zecher, a commemoration of the esrog. So maybe that's what you should do. Kamash Malon, the Tosefta comes and lets us hear that sometimes you'll create a churva from this because people are going to think that you need it. People are going to think that this is an obligation, and therefore, better don't add the extra item to the 4 species, the additional item, even though on the one hand it's commemorating the esrog, which you don't have, but on the other hand it's adding a potential misconception to people who see it, and they're going to start thinking, oh, you're supposed to use an orange for the 4 species. You're supposed to use that. I didn't know that was part of the. Okay, I guess next year we'll all bring oranges. So it could create a whole churva, whole destruction from such a mistake, from such a situation, and therefore don't do it. You say, what do you mean? I'm commemorating the esrog. Yeah, you're commemorating it with the potential that people are going to start learning from you and bringing an orange on there as part of their 4 species for sukkahs, right? So that's the Gemara that we did yesterday. I should mention that it's brought down the Rishonim, the commentaries, the early commentaries on the Gemara, called the Rishonim. So they mention about adding to the lulavim, adding on. What would you potentially add on? So, and it's brought in Rambam as well, that there seems to have been a custom to not just use the 3 hadassim. They would use more hadassim, beautify the lulav and esrog with extra hadassim. Possibly aravas as well, it seems like from some of the poskim that they write about aravas. And possibly you could have more than one or lulav and esrog as well. And so the Ritva brings that even though our Gemara says you're not allowed to be moisiv and you're not allowed to add or subtract, but that means adding on to adding on to the types, to add on a 5th type, that would be a problem. But doing
it like Lubavitch does it is fine.
Well, the Ritva writes, he first brings that there is a view that says, you see our Gemara, you're not allowed to add anything. Don't add anything. You can't. It's also, you look at our Gemara, it says you're not allowed to add anything. So that's what he brings. And then he says, but it's not true. Ein hadin kain, he says. The Ritva clarifies and says, nope, that's not correct. Because the Torah never gave us a maximum amount of hadassim and aravos and so on. It gives us a minimum. So if you used less than 2 aravos or less than 3 hadassim, that would be a problem. But we don't have a maximum shear, he says. And he says, however, the custom is not to add only hadassim and aravos, because when you add, it brings beauty. But a lulav and esrog, he says, that it's not extra beauty if you use 2 lulavim or 2 esrogim. So that is not really traditional to do. But he says to add the hadassim and aravos, that's a custom. So it is something you'll find on Sukkot. At least in Lubavitch, there's a tradition to add on to the hadassim, and it's based on this, on this concept of it's a noi, it's beauty to the mitzvah, and it's not a problem. And the problem of our Gemara is where you add or subtract an item from the 4 species. Yes, Mordechai.
Yeah, many years ago in this year that I heard somebody gave an example of adding on an olive branch to symbolize peace or something like that.
Adding an olive branch to what? To the 4 species?
Right.
Because there was someone who was forget what, the Seder plate, they wanted to add an orange or something. There is where some rabbi told them, if you do it this way, you ought to maybe just add on an orange. So some of them started adding on an orange. I forget what it was. They wanted to do something against halacha. So he said, if you're going to do that, you could add an orange to the Seder plate or something. Right? Anyone remember this? I don't know. Anyway, so there's some Shugayim, they add an orange to their Seder plate. Anyway, that's definitely against the tradition. But here it's for noi mitzvah. It's brought in the Rishonim that Inyan to add on. It's even brought in Shulchan Aruch actually to add a hadassim. Mentions it in the Shulchan Aruch. So there is such a custom to add hadassim, but the Gemara here is talking about adding on another species, and that is a problem. It's called baltoisif, and even to use another item to tie it, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is a problem. The rabbis didn't hold it's a problem, but which we'll see later but Rabbi Yehuda held that it's a problem even just to tie it with, because then it would be considered, since eged is a mitzvah, then if you tie it with something, that'll be like a 5th item that you're adding as a baltoisif, adding on to the mitzvahs. If the rabbis don't hold that the tying is necessity, therefore it would only be you happen to use something else to tie it, but it's not part of the mitzvah. It's not a problem of baltoisif. Yes, Jeffrey.
So, but we also have a point. I don't know where it comes up, that we're supposed to hold the top of the stalks of the leaves. You're supposed to hold it in the direction that it grows. Mm-hmm. Also, so if you tied it with something else, it clearly would not be being held in the same direction. It would not necessarily be the top of that type of vegetation. So maybe there wouldn't be a conflict.
I'm not sure what you're saying, because you could tie it with anything on the bottom.
Yeah, right. Even if it was another species, it wouldn't be held like we have to hold the forminim. The way that the fruit grows, the way that the stalks grow, you end up having the top of each stalk. If you had cut off the top of the stalk, you couldn't use more hadassim without having the top of each stalk.
Let's hold it, because I think we're getting. I think it's going to be coming up when we learn about the hadassim, and maybe you'll bring it. Try to remember maybe then.
Okay,
we'll talk about it then. Okay. So the next piece of Gemara, Toshima, we're on page 31b, and Toshima Esrog Hayoshon. Must be about, I don't know, 15 lines from the top. Maybe about 14, 15 lines from the top of the page on 31b. So Toshima, come and hear. And the Gemara is going to try to again prove Rava wrong. So I don't know why the Gemara. I mean, I guess the reason the Gemara interrupted was because it had brought a Tosefta, and the Gemara decided let's talk about that Tosefta. So it got a little sidetracked into the Tosefta, and now it's going back to the dialogue that we're having to debate Rava's qualification of Rabbi Yehuda, the rabbi's opinion about Yavesh and about the laws of Hadar, the law of Hadar, and Rava's way of explaining it. Gemara was initially started debating Rava, and the Gemara got a little sidetracked with one of the proofs, and it got involved talking about that Tosefta. Now the Gemara is going back, and it's going to ask another question on Rava. Toshima coming here. Esrog Hayashon, an old Esrog. It's basically it's dried out. The law is puzzle. It's invalid. Rabbi Yehuda machshir, but Rabbi Yehuda says it's kosher. And what do we see from this brisa? What we see is that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't seem to hold about the law of Hadar. It's definitely surprising. It says it in the pasuk. Can't really argue on a pasuk. Pasuk says pre-Eitz Hadar. But we'll have to see how he holds, how he learns the pasuk differently. But the point is that what Rava said, which was logical, that he explains that Hadar only applies to Esrog, not to Lulav. That statement, what we're seeing now is probably wrong. Let's see how the Gemara concludes. But it's probably wrong because Rava clearly says, because Rabbi Yehuda clearly says here in this brisa that an Esrog HaYoshon is kosher, even by Esrog, not just Lulav. So it sounds like it's wrong. So the Gemara concludes, and it says, Tiyuvta de Rava Tiyuvta. We have proven Rava wrong. We have proven him wrong. This is a proof. And Rava's words are now basically pushed aside, and we conclude that Rabbi Yehuda obviously does not hold of the law of Hadar, and he somehow is going to have to learn the pasuk differently. So Gemara says, so what is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda? V'loi boi Hadar. Does Rabbi Yehuda not hold of Hadar? He doesn't. V'anan tanan. Didn't we learn? And this is going to be taught in a Mishnah later. Hayarai kikarti. Something is green, like leeks. Reb Meir machshir. Reb Meir said.
Hi, hear me?
Yes, I'm here. This is Keir Beard.
Okay. So again, so it says Hadar doesn't need to be beautiful, even by Esrog. Didn't we learn in the Mishnah later? Hayara kikarti, it's green like karti, like leeks. Reb Meir machshir. Reb Meir says it's kosher, and Reb Yehuda Paisel. Reb Yehuda says it's invalid. And what's the reason? Isn't it because Reb Yehuda says that the esrog needs to be beautiful? So if it's that green, it's not going to be beautiful. The Gemara answers, Loi. No, it's not because Reb Yehuda holds of Hadar, because Reb Yehuda doesn't hold of Hadar. He doesn't hold it has to be beautiful. So the reason why it's not good if it's green is Mishum de Loi Gomar Pedro, because it's not kosher for the mitzvah, because it did not finish its growing. It's considered premature. It's considered it's unripe. It's not usable for the mitzvah. Not because of Hadar, not because it's not beautiful. It's simply not the item. it hasn't ripened. It's not. This is not what we're referring to, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda says it's puzzle. It's invalid. Okay, Tashema coming here. Shiur Esrog Katan, the measurement of the smallest measurement of an esrog. Reb Meir Oimer, Reb Meir says, Ke'egois, like a knot. Reb Yehuda Oimer, Ke'beitza, like an egg. Now, what is the reason that anything that is smaller than the egg would be invalid for the mitzvah? Why would he hold that it has to be so big? Lav mishum deboy hadar. Isn't it because it has to be beautiful, and when it's big, it is more beautiful. This is considered beautiful, and therefore it would make sense that Rabbi Yehuda holds of hadar. So the Gemara says, "Loi, that's not so. No, that's not because he doesn't hold this law because he holds that it has to be beautiful. It's mishum deloy gamar peira, because if it's not bigger and if it's not as big as an egg, it means it's not really fully grown, and therefore it's not considered usable for the mitzvah." Hashema coming here. Uva Godol coming here about Rabbi Yehuda's state law regarding hadar. Uva Godol, it says in the Mishnah, by the largest esrog usable for the mitzvah. What's the maximum size? Again, before we talked about the minimum size. Shiur esrog katan, the measurement of a small esrog. That's the minimum size. Now we're talking about Uva Gadol. This is a continuation of that Mishnah. That the Mishnah before said, what's the minimum size? Now it says, Bagadol, what is the maximum size? The maximum size of an esrog is that you could handle two of them in one hand. That's the maximum size. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. If it's bigger than that, it's invalid. Rabbi Yossi says, "Afilu echad b'shtei yodov," even one in two hands. You have like a watermelon esrog, a watermelon esrog, waterlogged. So the thing is,
pictures like that. They always show pictures right before Yontif of kids in Israel walking around with esrogim the size of pumpkins.
Oh yeah, I don't think I've seen them, but I've been told that they've tried to have esrogim grow here in Florida, and it's not that they don't grow; they will grow, but they're so big that they're going to have a lot of blemishes, and they're also heavy, so not exactly so comfortable to use on Sukkot if you have to walk around carrying it. But anyway, so what is the maximum size? So Rabbi Yehuda says that the maximum size is two in one hand. Rabbi Yossi says the maximum size, even if you have one in two hands, very big. My taima, what is the reason of Rabbi Yehuda? Why would he say his maximum size? What is the reason for that maximum size? Because Rabbi Yehuda holds that something that is too large doesn't look nice. Isn't it because he needs it to be beautiful? And if it's so big, it won't be beautiful. Here now we have a little understanding what that would mean. It could, in other words, the simple reading of the Gemara is maybe just the size is not hadar, but it could be that what he's saying is that when it's that big, there's going to be other blemishes that will make it not beautiful. In other words, there'll be so many blemishes around it that it wouldn't be beautiful. I'm just adding based on the practical side of it. You could say that that's maybe there's a little deeper meaning over there. But on a simple level, it just means that because it's large, that's not called beautiful. It's a little too large. So the Gemara says, no, Lloyd, that's not the reason of Rabbi Yehuda. Kivan diyama Rabba, since Rabba says, lulav biyamin, biyesreg b'smoil, that the lulav is supposed to be in the right hand, the esreg is supposed to be in the left hand. Zimnin de machalfile, sometimes it'll happen that a person will take it in the wrong hand. V'asi la puchinu, and he's going to switch it. And v'asi le'ipsuli, he's going to end up ruining the esrog by invalidating it because it's going to fall because it's so big, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda says you shouldn't use such a large. Not because of hadar, it's not because it's beautiful, because it's going to be problematic. You're going to end up not having an esrog, as often happens in households with children. The esrog, the kids start playing with it, and goodbye. The pitum breaks off, and it's not uncommon. It happens.
So it looks like that word lafuchunhe.
Yeah.
Maybe it means to turn it over. That we have this custom to have it down first, and then we have to turn it up. So it looks like hifuch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the thing is that why does he start off with the lulav biyamin and esrog b'smo? According to you, it should have said you have to hold them in the derech dilason, the way they grow. So it seems like it's that you're going to switch hands.
Okay, thank you.
I think. No, that's what it sounds like to me.
I can't add a Rashi about it. So
Rabbi, isn't there Hidulatol meaning that that you have to have the lulav pointing upward?
Yeah. But that, and Jeffrey was hinting to that. Yeah, but it doesn't say that.
So what's the big deal? I mean, the fact that when you hold your etrog, you're also holding it according to the way it. Well, actually not. Because where the etrog is cut, that's the connection, and the pitum is actually pointing downward.
Uh-huh. But I guess when it starts growing,
because of the way the etrog, because of the weight.
The weight. Yeah, because of the weight. Right. But I think the way it grows is it starts off the other way. And then because of the weight, it sort of weighs it down and it hangs down. If I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
Anyway, okay, so but we didn't learn that. That's we didn't learn that about the derech dilason now. That I was just just Jeffrey brought that in. Yes, Isaac.
I just wanted to show you a few pictures of esrogim. So,
okay, let me just finish this last line before you do it. Okay, then I'll let you share screen. The Ella Rebbe Yehuda Haksiv Hadar. So the Gemara says, what's this whole big deal? We're making all these questions on Rebbe Yehuda. The obvious question is the pasuk says Hadar. You want to give me a proof from this Mishnah and that Mishnah? The pasuk says pre-8 Hadar. It's got to be a beautiful fruit. So the Gemara says, Ella Rebbe Yehuda Haksiv Hadar. It says the word Hadar right there. So the Gemara answers, that the meaning of that word is not Hadar, it's not beautiful. It means Hadar be'ilana mishana lashana. It's a fruit that's dar. It's a fruit that dwells. It dwells on its tree from year to year, which means that it does not fall off the tree. Did you ever hear of a fruit that after it ripens, it won't fall off the tree? The esrog tree is that way, that it stays on the tree and it doesn't fall off. And that's an esrog. And that's what that's the way Rabbi Yehuda learns the word hadar, that it means hadar, that it dwells and it doesn't fall off the tree. Okay, Isaac, you're welcome to show us your picture.
Not mine, did it come up?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, then it won't. I'm gonna.
Now it just came. 1 second.
Yeah, but that wasn't the image.
Oh.
Never mind. I'm sorry.
No, you'll figure it out. You have to have that other image in the background,
Right.
like somehow.
My
Okay,
screen just went totally dark. Okay.
no, it's very clear now.
Well, they do look pretty big, so I think the picture is good now. I don't know.
Tremendous.
These look quite large.
You
It looks
see
like-
us Reagan now?
Yeah, it looks like it's bigger
Yeah,
than this
I
guy's
mean-
head.
Take,
Yeah.
take a look.
This is
It
the
looks like-
Ammonite
I'm not visible.
Esroigim. And this is, I guess, from Australia.
Australian Esrogim?
Growing Esrog down under. That's the article. Let's see.
Uh-huh. Wow. All right. Very good. So let's just conclude over here.
Sorry.
So we saw the opinion of Reb Yehuda. We discussed it at great length of where does Reb Yehuda say his halacha about dried out is kosher. In the initial understanding, which was very logical, was Rava's interpretation that it should only apply to a lulav, but the esrog, it says hadar, so obviously it should not be dried out. That was the initial understanding. The Gemara brought numerous questions on Rava's way of interpreting it, and the Gemara, and then the Gemara even brought questions on Reb Yehuda himself that by Esra the Gemara brought. In other words, even contrary to what Rava said. Rava said that Reb Yehuda agrees by Esra that it has to be beautiful. And then the Gemara brought many. We brought a proof. First, the Gemara proves it that Reb Yehuda really doesn't. The Yehuda's statement doesn't exclude Esra from this dried out rule that it's that an esrog doesn't exclude esrog to be different than doesn't differentiate between esrog and lulav, and both of them they're dried out. They're going to be kosher, and the Gemara proved it, and that proves Rava wrong. And then the Gemara had all these questions, and the conclusion is that Reb Yehuda does not hold that it even says hadar by esrog. It says the word hadar, but it doesn't mean beautiful. It means that it dwells on its tree, mishana lishana. Okay, so that's how we're going to stop here. And Zayuzant, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Shakar.
Thank you.